The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome, everybody. Good morning from New York State. This is Andrew Wilkinson, Director of Trading Education with Interactive Brokers and headquartered in Greenwich, Connecticut. Today's event is from WisdomTree, my colleagues over in the London office. And today I'm joined by Christopher Gannatti, who's a CFA and the Head of Research for Europe at WisdomTree. He's going to be talking about cybersecurity, the megatrend that every business must consider. But before I pass you over to Chris, I just want to go through the disclosure slide with you. If you could put that up for us onto the screen, thank you very much. And if the audience would pay attention to that, just peruse that, because it does address some of the issues and risks associated with investing in general and some of the topics that Chris might touch on today. A couple of pieces of housekeeping before we begin. Today's event's being recorded. We will send you a link if you've registered for the event about 2 hours after the end of the live event. Look out in your inbox for that. If you have questions for Chris, please enter them throughout the session, and we'll try and get into a Q&A at the end of Chris's presentation. So please use that question bank in the GoToWebinar panel there. Also, you'll see a handouts panel. Today's presentation has been put into PDF format by WisdomTree for download, and you can save that onto your computer and refer back to it when you need to. And one other thing I should mention, WisdomTree ETFs are available on the Trader Workstation platform at zero commission. So please look out for that on the under the education menu at ibkr.com. All right, that's enough from me. Chris Gannatti, please tell us a little bit about your role at WisdomTree, and then tell us about what we're going to be talking about today.
Beautiful. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you everyone for taking the time. As stated, my name is Chris Gannatti. I am the head of research at WisdomTree based in Europe. So even though I don't sound like it, I'm sitting more or less in the center of London. If you were looking on a map, Tottenham Court Road is right outside the window basically here. And at WisdomTree, we manage roughly 240 distinct investment vehicles that, if clients so choose, they could invest in. I am managing a 9-person team. I can't distinctly say I am equally familiar with every single asset class, but that's why we have a team. There are people with experience in commodities, cryptocurrencies, fixed income, you name it. If it's publicly traded and liquid enough to be in an exchange-traded product wrapper, there is a very good chance that WisdomTree is covering that asset class, and you could find a tool for use in your portfolio. So with that, I will transition into our topic for today, cybersecurity, the megatrend that every business must consider. I say every in the title there because if you think of today's world, and if you're about to consume a product or a service through some sort of a distributor, be it digital or otherwise, and it comes up in conversation that they're not thinking of cybersecurity at all, in today's world, that would be almost a bit off-putting, a bit strange, given how much publicity things like ransomware and hacking do tend to get. And by no means do I know exactly which companies or which services different businesses are going to choose. It's a very competitive market, but at the end of the day, you have to imagine that you're taking a huge risk if you are not thinking of cybersecurity each and every day of your operation. So the current landscape in 2021, I found a few interesting articles, and if you Google the top passwords of 2020, I'm sure you as well would find interesting articles. I'm amazed how they find this stuff out, but then again, if you sort of think of psychology or behavioral finance, it's not that surprising that it's easy to type 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and that tends to be confirmed by multiple different sources as one of the top password options that people use. The word password, crazily enough, even though it's featured in many comedy movies, tends to be one of the top passwords that people use. And so as parts of this presentation, you tend to, when you're starting to look at the space, think about all the highly technical things like quantum encryption and, hacking and, is my bank account secure? And again, all these things that require tens of millions of investment and constant upkeep. But usually the way that systems are broken into, it's not the government of Russia or the government of China or the government of North Korea. It's a person tricking another person into clicking on something that they otherwise shouldn't. And there we go. Along that line, if anyone is interested in the topic of social engineering, I highly recommend, this is a podcast. I'm a big podcast person myself, but I highly recommend a podcast called Darknet Diaries. And this was their episode 90. If you listen to it, it listens like it could be a movie, because you also have to remind yourself, this is not a fictional series of stories. The person telling the stories actually did all of these things that sound basically that like secret agent type of stuff in different countries around the world. It's absolutely incredible. And yes, there is such a job that exists where an organization of some kind will say, we want to know if our system is vulnerable. So trick whoever you have to trick, do whatever you have to do, and see if you can get access to XYZ on such and such server. And it's enthralling, it's captivating listening. Again, if you're interested in the topic, I highly recommend. There are many episodes of this podcast, but this one in particular, again, it reminds you that we spend all this time on the technical stuff, but at the end of the day, usually the vast majority of hacking is done through people. Now, as we've seen different world events, there was a lot of publicity when Elon Musk tweeted about Signal. So that is the Signal that is on the page. Signal is seen to have open source encryption. When you're starting to look at these things, I took this information from a nice Wall Street Journal article that created a summary. You see the article if you wanted to Google it in the sources at the bottom. But one of the things you learn when reading the article, at least that I learned, was open source encryption is sort of your best bet, in the sense that it's verifiable, it can be tested, different experts could try to crack into it, and over time you would imagine that the open source nature, the fact that everything's being shared, bodes well for your security potential. Now, all of these applications have positives and negatives. So what's the negative for Signal? Well, it doesn't quite have the 2 billion or 1 billion plus users that WhatsApp or iMessage might have, respectively. Telegram was in the news a lot, not so much recently, but if you think back to when Hong Kong was amassing the different protests, the fact that you could have up to 200,000 members in a particular group was quite useful in that particular scenario. So again, as you're thinking of encryption, it doesn't have to be this abstract thing necessarily. Every time that you're using WhatsApp, in a way, you're using and benefiting from encryption. But what's the potential negative? Well, it's owned by Facebook. And so, Mark Zuckerberg at times can be a polarizing figure. And ultimately, you never know what they can or can't necessarily change or do with the platform that they spent almost 20 billion to acquire. Quantum computing comes up a lot, usually in some form of, oh my God, if quantum computers exist, every form of encryption that we have had to date becomes obsolete. So saying it in that extreme a manner is maybe a bit too alarmist. Quantum computers of a substantial enough size and computing power could conceivably do a much faster and more efficient job of factoring very, very large numbers. What is factoring? I show an example on the page there. You would basically start with the number 491 6,597. Again, it's listed right there on the page. And the concept would be find the prime factors that would get you that number. So it's very, very, very hard for a conventional computer to figure out 593 times 829 equals that number. And the numbers we're talking about with, as you see in the text, 2048-bit encryption. I had to Google it. I admit I think it's slightly more than 600 digits. So we're looking at a 6-digit number. We're now talking about a 600-digit number. So it's exponentially harder to factor such a large number. But various articles and scientific studies and experiments are postulating, and if we were in 2015, we would say you would need roughly 1 billion qubits to reliably break this standard of encryption. And the way quantum computing works is not like a conventional computer where we sit down and we look at the bottom of the laptop and say, oh, this has a 1 terabyte hard drive and a certain megahertz processor and all the rest, and you just know it's always there. Quantum is very much probability driven. So to have 1 billion working qubits, you would have to have some multiple of that, maybe 10 billion qubits, to ensure that at all times you have 1 billion working qubits. We are a long way away from a billion qubits, or as you see in the next line, 20 million qubits at the end of the day. We are not anywhere close to that level of stable amounts of qubits. So in today's world, there is not an immediate danger, at least, again, from what we know publicly. I can't comment on what the NSA or other intelligence agencies may or may not have. If you want to go down those rabbit holes, they may have the capability, who knows, and it's just not public. But in the public space, what we're dealing with in terms of quantum computing is Microsoft has their effort, IBM has their effort, Google or Alphabet have their effort, Amazon is sort of making certain firms like IonQ's resources available to some of the cloud computing customers. So usually what's happening is the biggest players in the space are using their cloud computing platform to give people some initial access. So you're seeing people starting to initially try out and use quantum computing. We're probably multiple years away from, again, quantum computers large enough and easily accessible enough such that all encryption is at risk. Now, that's not to say that firms are not trying to make progress here. If you look at Visa and MasterCard, for example, businesses that depend on the security of transactions and encryption, they're already thinking about it. And there is such a thing as quantum-proof encryption. So definitely don't walk away thinking there's no such thing as quantum-proof encryption. It's just, it has to be a different type of math at the end of the day. Please don't make me try to explain it here. I'm not a quantum expert myself. I just try to read up on the space as best as possible. But there is such a thing, again, as quantum-based encryption. But fascinating topic. Definitely recommend looking at that if, again, you're interested in the space. Now, when we think of basic infrastructure, and there was a big story, this is from the story that took place in Florida. You see that it was reported on the 8th of February, 2021 in the source material. And it really just relates to something that is fairly common in the sense that firms or governments or local governments, state governments, they could be turning over different employees all the time. And in this particular case, from the sound of it, the employees could use TeamViewer, which is a fairly commonly accessible tool that users can remotely access different networks through. And the plant essentially had upgraded their system and they weren't using TeamViewer anymore, but they didn't necessarily delete. You know how difficult it is to remember to delete apps on your phone, as one example. So they didn't delete the previous access on TeamViewer, and an employee that no longer worked there, they didn't revoke his credentials. It almost reads, again, like something that you could logically see in an episode of a certain show or movie. And of course, now the employee, they're not doing anything necessarily crazy. They're just using the access that they always had and that was never revoked to get into the system, start to change some chemistries. In this particular case, it was noticed before anything serious happened. But you read enough articles, you see that whether it's water, whether it's the power grid, whether it's other types of infrastructure, you are always hearing about the vulnerability. And it's a general statement in the cyber realm that countries like the United States are extremely capable in what they can do offensively, meaning how they can attack other groups, nations, actors, etc. The defensive situation is much different, and it's nowhere near as advanced or as hardened as the offensive capability. So that is something certainly important to keep in mind. You can see the Biden administration commenting on different plans relating to these topics. Now, sometimes you see platforms, and I could almost substitute a different year and LinkedIn in there, and basically same idea. You have a platform with a lot of information that people are voluntarily providing, and once people are voluntarily providing that type of information, whether it's names, addresses, birthdays, career histories, whatever this is, it could become a target for hackers. And in the case of Facebook, 2019, you see it right there in the headline, data from approximately 533 million accounts was made public. One thing that you could take away from this webinar, if you're thinking, I want to mitigate risk in my own stuff, the jump from one-factor authentication, meaning you type in your password and you're in the website, whether it's your bank, your Facebook account, or anything else, versus turning on the two-factor authentication. Usually that means you get a text message in your phone, or you get a certain code in an app in your phone. Going from one-factor to two-factor dramatically reduces your risk. I don't know of anything that takes your risk to zero in any case. I don't think that's possible. But going from one-factor to two-factor, what you're doing is you're making it that much harder for a nefarious actor to get your information. Cyber attacks are also a venue for nation states to skirmish outside of conventional warfare, exactly as it says there. So again, you can substitute. I know years ago, there was sort of the Russia versus Ukraine case that was widely publicized, where essentially in a certain city in Ukraine, Russia, more or less, or a group of Russian hackers turned off the power to the city for a certain period of time. It would appear that a similar thing may have been done. It usually takes years to fully verify for all the information to come out, but it's largely suspected and has been reported, let's say, that China made some moves in this particular case related to India, and a part of India lost power for a certain amount of time. And you see kind of how they do it. Large-scale phishing attacks, 40,300, roughly speaking, over 5 days. And again, what are they trying to do? They're trying to use the rule of large numbers to say, if we send it to enough people, somebody is going to be, thinking haphazardly and not remembering their security training. And as a result, they click on the link and boom, they have access and they're able to do various things that you otherwise would not want done. Ransomware, much larger problem. Why is ransomware a larger problem of late? Well, part of it has to do with the pandemic, in the sense that the pandemic changed behavior. It became much more common for many more people to not necessarily work from a localized venue, an office, and to be accessing networks from outside of the office. When you have more people accessing networks from the outside of a given office setting, then that network, if you're not taking the appropriate steps, could be more vulnerable. And greater vulnerability creates opportunity for hackers. And then you put that alongside certain types of cryptocurrency, which could create a degree of anonymity as it relates to payment. So you could accept payment and you don't have to divulge necessarily your identity, or it's much harder to figure out the identity of parties on the other side. That's another way in which you could see certain actors increasing their use of ransomware. And I like this particular slide. So one of the things I did, as you'll see throughout the presentation, is you learn a lot by looking at what some of the biggest firms in the space are publicizing in their various investment decks, because their investment decks are saying we provide these services and this is what we're seeing in the market and this is our opportunity. And if there's a big enough opportunity, the investors get excited because then they see, oh, this could be a great return. So in FireEye's investment deck, it noted that the Mandiant response engagements increased 10 times in 2020 relative to what they were doing in 2018. So that's 2 years, a 10x increase. The average cost range, it depends on the company and the situation. You see a wide variance in the numbers, but they were reporting 250,000 all the way up to 50 million USD. And the average payment increased upwards of 180% from March of 2019 to March of 2020, when again we were starting in the developed world to go into pandemic conditions. And look, the unfortunate fact is 1 in 10 businesses actually had to close due to a ransomware attack, again, based on the reports from FireEye's internal group here. So ransomware is absolutely a threat. It can affect any business of any size, and it's one of the key reasons that you've got to be vigilant and paying attention all the time for things like phishing attempts and the like. So if you think of cybersecurity, frequently in a lot of our conversations at WisdomTree, you are talking about lots of different megatrends. And at WisdomTree, we sort of have a family of different megatrends that we cover, and we cover artificial intelligence, and we cover cloud computing. And frequently in our conversations with investors, they might say, is there an overlap between cloud computing and cybersecurity? And we're going to see the answer is absolutely yes. Is there an overlap between artificial intelligence and cybersecurity? Absolutely yes. So it's not as though cybersecurity exists off to the side somewhere and it's completely independent of all other megatrends. Frequently, if you believe that artificial intelligence is a key megatrend, or you believe cloud computing is a key megatrend, in a way, you're also putting at least some belief into cybersecurity, because it's very difficult to effectively have artificial intelligence or cloud computing resources and not have some type of cybersecurity solution operating alongside. So at the end of the day, the pandemic has not necessarily dampened investment enthusiasm. What we're looking at here is a chart from a report published by Stanford University, their AI Index 2021 annual report, as you see in the source material. And the first thing I focus on is, what do the different colors mean? The purple color means you had companies responding to a survey saying they decreased their investments in artificial intelligence. The greenish color means they made no change. So if they were making investments, they continued to do so. If they were not making investments, they continued to do so. And then at the end of the day, the blue indicates that even though it was pandemic conditions, that they actually increased their investments in artificial intelligence. And so in a way, you could say that only 23%, meaning 77%, either had no change or increased their investments in artificial intelligence. And you see how that's a bit different depending on the different industries that you're looking at. But there's a lot of uptick and a lot of increase in artificial intelligence during the pandemic. But then you say, okay, when companies are adopting artificial intelligence, that is not something that happens without risk. So what risks did those companies necessarily cite when they were thinking about adopting artificial intelligence? And top risk, you see it right there on the page, cybersecurity. It was the top risk in 2019. It remained as the top risk in 2020. And not only that, but you're basically now seeing what risk did the companies take steps to mitigate. Well, they took the most sort of mitigating activity to cybersecurity in 2019, and they took even more in 2020, or at least a larger percentage of the respondents were saying that they were taking mitigating steps to manage the risk of cybersecurity and adopting artificial intelligence. So many people might, prior to this webinar, have heard of AI, or maybe even been investing in AI, or believed that it was going to have a profound impact in various industries or various parts of society. And you see right here that the companies, the businesses that are adopting AI are definitively thinking about cybersecurity right alongside. Cloud computing is an interesting one because, in a sense, cloud computing got a huge amount of publicity as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Why was that the case? Well, we're using a tool right now called GoToWebinar to deliver this webinar. And in the pre-pandemic period, it would be far more frequent, not that we didn't do webinars at all, but it would be far more frequent that I would fly to a location and there'd be a bunch of people, and maybe there's a stage or a room or a table and people are eating a meal, and we do a talk right there physically in the location. What happened, one of the things that happened, it was the reason for the incredible return of companies like Zoom during the 2020 calendar year, is with the pandemic, people had to say, look, people still want the information. They're still interested in the topics. There are still equity markets and returns and investments, but you can't necessarily fly to every location in quite the same way without significant risk. And so there was massive adoption of platforms exactly like we're using right now. And the interesting thing to consider is, even though the communications platforms are very tangible and they get a lot of attention, and they got a lot of attention in 2020, that's not the only solution. There are cybersecurity solutions that are delivered through the cloud. There are human resource solutions that are delivered through the cloud. There are diversity, equity, and inclusion solutions that are delivered through the cloud. So it's almost, the more I look at the cloud computing space, it's almost like if you can think of software solving a particular issue, a particular problem, or at least helping to make something more efficient, if you could think of that as being possible, it's highly probable that either there's already a public company providing that solution, or if not that, there are thousands of private cloud companies potentially already trying to assess that solution. And the thought, as you look at the page here, you see the blue growing from the left to the right. As you get to 2030, the fact of the level of the blue is telling you that roughly 83% of the enterprise software market is predicted to be in the cloud or delivered by the cloud by 2030. So the vast majority of how businesses will consume software is changing, and those changes by 2030 it could be even more than 83%. It could be 100%. You don't know where things are going to go. It could be less than 80% as well. This is merely a forecast, but there's just such a convenience. The days of putting a CD in a drive in your computer seem to be behind us. The days of worrying if your software is up to date or if you have the most current security package, those days are behind us. So cloud computing, there are a lot of conveniences that are offered to the user as well as the issuer of the software, and it creates a massive incentive for adoption. And something we talk about a lot, and this comes from an article in the Wall Street Journal that was published last summer. I find it notable because we just talked about how the pandemic, it was a megaphone and almost like a magnifying glass for the cloud computing space, and cloud has almost become a household name as a result of it. But if you think of what was happening or what the trend was even before the pandemic, so you go back, you wind back the clock to 2019, which feels like forever ago at this stage, but indulge me, go back to 2019, and what you see on the page is the lighter blue color for the first time, based on this particular series, eclipsed or went higher than the darker blue color, which is saying that for the first time, based on the data being measured here, the cloud infrastructure services were slightly more than the data center hardware and software, the on-premises infrastructure services. So that's a big step, and you can kind of see that back in 2009, the first year of the 10 years essentially shown on the chart. In 2009, cloud was nowhere. You need a magnifying glass to see the light blue. But when you get to 2019, it was already beginning to be equal to and even eclipse the other longstanding option. And so as a result of that, I remind people that yes, the prior page was a forecast, but the shift towards the cloud, even pre-pandemic, was already starting. People were already aware, businesses were already aware. And what's possible is that maybe things happened 2 or 3 years sooner than they otherwise would have. People found those budgets and made those transitions and found that time sooner than they otherwise would have to accelerate the cloud adoption. And if you want to make it tangible, frequently one of the things I try to do in these presentations, and this is from the Cloudflare investor presentation, but I thought it was even applicable beyond just thinking about Cloudflare, which is a cloud security provider, is you think of what people used to do, that on-premises solution, and you see it on the left-hand side of the page. You see some of the brands of the companies. If you were trying to do a network, you would potentially use solutions from these companies. If you were looking for applications, you would use solutions from these other companies. If you were looking for storage or compute resources, you would look at these companies. And you clearly see that, you say, okay, storage and compute in today's world, you rent it. It's almost like you think of how you use Uber. You need to get somewhere, you call the Uber, and you pay for just that one trip. Well, if you need a computational task performed, you contract with, one of the cloud providers listed, and you pay literally for that task. And maybe you have a monthly fee that gives you a certain amount of computational resource or storage all the time. But that model is such that you don't need to maintain a giant server farm in the basement of your operation, recognizing that for the vast majority of time, like at night, potentially, depending on your business, you may not even be using it at all. And it may just be sitting there with downtime. So the idea of renting storage, computational power, and contracting out security to a given network, these are all very interesting ideas, and they relate to this idea of companies shifting from on-premises to the cloud more and more. So the fact that we seem to know a lot about the space comes down to the partnership that we have with Team8. So Team8 is an exciting company. I'm pretty amazed each time I mention this. So many people are familiar with the NSA in the United States, sort of the foremost cyber body, part of the government. And, you hear the acronyms or the jokes, no such agency. And I've never worked there myself, so I, definitely don't know exactly what their capabilities may or may not be other than listening to different podcasts of things that have been made public. But a former director of the NSA is part of the leadership team of Team8, the firm that we're working with when we're thinking about cybersecurity and working with investors on cybersecurity. And if that wasn't enough, we also have former leading members of the Israeli Defense Force, that's what IDF stands for, Unit 8200, which is a version of Israel's essentially cyber capability. And, things like Stuxnet, if people are familiar, one of the most preeminent attacks when it's largely thought that the United States and Israel partnered together on a piece of malware that was implanted into the Iranian nuclear development project, setting that project back multiple different years. So the capability of Israel and the United States in this space is really unquestioned. It really competes among the top capabilities on Earth, and ultimately to be able to work with that level of capability is remarkable. What Team8 is doing is they're working with the Fortune 500, 350 plus of the Fortune 500, as you see in the upper right. And they're familiar with what the needs are from a cybersecurity perspective amongst the C-level executives. And they're also familiar with the entrepreneurs that might have an interesting idea or a solution, but may not be sure of who they could partner with or who they could sell it to. And so creating those alignments, similar to what a venture capitalist might do or a venture finance firm might do, that's what, when Teammate's not working with WisdomTree, that's what they're doing in their day-to-day. Now, one of the things that we wanted them to do when they were working with us was to conceptualize the future of cybersecurity. It's nice to consider the past and companies that might be very, very large because they had the perfect solution in 2010 or 2015, whatever it was. But we've seen in the last year, conditions have changed, businesses have changed, the way people are interacting with networks has changed. And your cybersecurity approach and how you focus on that space must change alongside the changes in behaviors and activities. And I won't read all of the words there, but they came out with 7 key development themes that they thought were the most effective way to focus on the companies providing those solutions that are going to bring us through, at least in their opinion, the 2020s. And you see cloud security is one, smarter security, that's sort of the intersection of artificial intelligence. That's another. Perimeterless world is another that has to do with cloud computing and the fact that, you know, the office can't necessarily be based on a physical space anymore. Security of things relates to the Internet of Things. And so these are all very interesting ways in which you can track and evaluate the solutions that different companies are providing. And so they also provided certain statistics. I won't go through all of them here. People who want to reference the presentation, definitely feel free to go to page 21 and see some of the key things that have been happening in each of those 7 distinct themes. And you can see that working with Teammate and the expertise that they bring when people are trying to dig deeper, frequently when we work with investors, they want to dig deeper into particular themes and determine, you know, what is meant by cloud security or what is meant by smarter security. And on page 22, you see some of the various examples in that particular space. And page 23 is sort of the continuation. Now, I wanted to zero in on a topic, homomorphic encryption. It's one of those things, and I admit before I was taught what it was, I'm not an encryption expert, so I did not come into my cybersecurity experience just automatically knowing what that was. I imagine nobody on this webinar would have even thought to focus on that word if I didn't bring it up. But it's a great example of something that could really fit a very interesting need if you start to conceptualize it. I want you to picture the idea of the fact that there is a global health issue, let's say a pandemic. So it's very parallel to what's happening today. And to figure out whether you're thinking of the mortality rate of a particular virus or pathogen, whether you're thinking about the effectiveness of a vaccine, whether you're trying to determine if certain groups, ethnicities, genders have different susceptibilities to the pathogen in question, these are all interesting bits of information that could be used to benefit public health. So yes, sometimes private health data is a very charged topic and people want to ensure its safety and they want to ensure that it's only shared with the appropriate people. But at the same time, the public health system needs data in order to function. Enter homomorphic encryption. The concept, even though it sounds completely like something you need at least 2 PhDs to fully understand, what it really does is it allows for calculations to be done on encrypted data. So you could be part of a study relating to public health based on where you live, and your information could help come up with conclusions that lead to better public safety in your particular area, but at no time was the data used in the calculation ever connected back to your specific name and personal identifying information, because the data was encrypted the entire time that the study was being done and that the calculations were being performed. If you want to make it real concrete, it would be the concept of, you know, that Microsoft Azure in their cloud platform is doing calculations on the data, but at no time can Microsoft Azure ever isolate your specific data. It just knows that there is data. They can perform the calculations needed, but they cannot connect any piece of data back to an individual person. So in the public health space, this is a very interesting topic, and it's a very interesting topic in many other spaces where, again, privacy is important, but at the same time, being able to gain insights on data in large numbers of people also might be important and very necessary for public health reasons. Cloud security is one of the biggest cutting edge areas in cybersecurity today. You see certain companies, in case people are interested and wondering, you know, let's make it a bit more concrete. What companies are some of the biggest and most prominent involved in cloud security? You see Cloudflare, CrowdStrike, and a bunch of others listed on the page. And if we think of what type of scale these companies are operating on, so you go into the Cloudflare investor presentation, and you almost have to read it 2 or 3 times to believe it, because you're saying, wow, 57 billion cyber threats blocked per day on just Cloudflare's platform. So this platform is not necessarily used by, you know, the entire internet. It's just one player in the space. As you see, 17% of the Fortune 1000 are paying customers. So it's large, yes, but it's certainly not the entire internet. So you have to then say, wow, there's even more than 57 billion distinct threats happening each and every day, which is a massive opportunity set to consider. Now, I found this one particularly insightful. So if we're doing a webinar on cloud computing, we focus on the top line, the cloud IT spend, IaaS, that's infrastructure as a service, PaaS, that's platform as a service, vendor revenue estimates from IDC, and you see in 2020, 106 billion, so definitely a large number. By 2023, more than doubling to 217 billion. And this is what, you know, versions of this are basically reported when AWS is reporting its revenue, or Microsoft Azure is reporting its revenue, or Google Cloud or IBM. This is what those companies are trying to grow. They're trying to make sure that people are spending more money on infrastructure as a service and platform as a service. Now you then say, okay, you know, it's a big market and it's growing, you know, 30% or so each and every year, and projected to continue. What about the cloud security spending? 1.2 billion in 2020, so 1.1% of total, and then 2.0 billion, so growing a little bit by 2023. So that's remarkable. People, to gain access to the platforms, 217 billion by 2023. To secure the platforms, 2 billion. So it's remarkable how little security has entered the considerations. This is, you know, the perspective, as you see on the bottom in the source material of CrowdStrike, but it's widely known. We talked about it from an infrastructure, a hard infrastructure perspective, the water company example. It's widely known that frequently companies are not thinking enough about security, and this is one quantitative way to consider that. Security of things. So we saw, we didn't spend too much time on it, but one of the prior pages estimated that by 2025, almost 56 billion connected devices would exist, meaning 56 billion devices are sending data somewhere. You don't always know where. You know, if you have the Amazon Alexa or some of these other things, Google Assistant, you get the sense they might be listening at any time and sending data somewhere, most likely to the parent company. And you hope if you ever needed access to it, you could get it. But if you're like me, you're not 100% sure. Another thing to consider, ARM, which is the company that's currently owned by SoftBank and targeted for acquisition by NVIDIA. It's based in the UK, again, where I'm currently sitting right now. And ARM estimates that by 2035, there might be 1 trillion connected devices and more than 1 trillion semiconductors in operation. So that's a remarkable amount of data. Now, what is it also a remarkable amount of? It's a remarkable amount of devices that could be targeted by hackers. And what might a breach look like? So I fully admit I'm a head of research. I'm not they call it a CISO, a Chief Information Security Officer. So that's the C-level position that would be responsible for information security. And they might have a service coming from a firm like Rapid7. And if there's an event, quote unquote, so there's a hacking going on or some access that otherwise shouldn't happen, there would be a dashboard that conceivably the CISO would see, and you could see the assets that are directly accessible to the attacker. You could see the accounts potentially accessible, the endpoints potentially accessible, and you can manage it. So what is a firm like Rapid7 doing? They're allowing the appropriate people in the company the capability to immediately manage the risks of breaches and network events. The estimated consequences of a breach, I mean, we saw earlier, 1 in 10 businesses have to fold due to ransomware. I've seen this statistic before. You know, you see the fact that the incurred cost of a data breach could be up to 4 million USD per lost record. And when you think of breaches, I know in 2018, Marriott was breached, British Airways was breached. The reputational damage alone of being cited in multiple articles. Think of the poor people who must be working at SolarWinds. I mean, every single day for almost 3 months, I would open the Wall Street Journal in the tech section, and I would see a new article about some other thing being found out with SolarWinds. So that's almost the breach of all breaches. But you know, companies all the time are faced with these things, and the reputational damage alone could be staggering. Perimeterless world. Many of us were forced into familiarity with this, needing to, on the dime, shift from working in an office to working from home or working from some other location. And what that means is the opportunity set that a company like OneSpan is selling into is changing. If you think of where things were in 2015, what this is showing is the product penetration of OneSpan was focused on things like authentication software, we've already talked about two-factor authentication. This is tokens, mobile security, and now if you're thinking of 2020, you've got things like e-signature, if anyone's familiar with DocuSign, as well as cloud-based security gaining more and more prominence. But as we saw, there's a long distance that companies can still travel. You know, it's one of those things where when there is a breach, if you're unfortunate enough to be subject to one, you wish you would have spent more on the insurance. In many cases, cybersecurity is either assurance or insurance against that very terrible event that could befall your personal situation or your corporate situation, whatever the case may be. So the conclusion, cybersecurity is subject to continual evolution and innovation. The defenders gain, the attackers gain. The defenders gain, the attackers gain. It's definitely that type of situation, whether you're thinking of it at the government level, you know, China versus the US or North Korea versus the US, et cetera, you know, fill in the blank. It's the same at the corporate level. There's a lot of money to be made. There are a lot of assets that are not as secure as they otherwise should be. And so attackers are motivated all the time to keep improving. And that means defenders need to always be upping their game. Ultimately, there's always going to be headlines. We're going to continue to see them. Ransomware, phishing, you've got to be prepared. There's a constant race, as I just alluded to. and there is no substitute for experience and expertise when it comes to cybersecurity. That's why at WisdomTree we work with a partner, teammate, and definitely they bring a lot to the table in this particular regard. So if anyone is looking for more information about WisdomTree, we did prepare this sheet here. So as I alluded to, cybersecurity is not the only thing we cover. People might have other interests, and so those interests can be found at wisdomtree.eu, just as further information on cybersecurity can be found at wisdomtree.eu. And while I'm showing the disclaimer page, I'll open up the tab here and see if I could see any questions.
Chris, excellent presentations. A couple of questions come in there. One from Yang at the bottom there says, from an investor's perspective, how can one access a public firm's vulnerability to cyber threats if one wants to hedge?
Interesting. So you're basically saying you've got public firms, the public firms are vulnerable, and you're seeking an investment that would increase in value if you saw a breach. It's interesting. We sought at WisdomTree, we sought to create an investment vehicle of firms that provide cybersecurity solutions. So during the SolarWinds hack, when it was perceived that FireEye had sort of found the breach, or at least found the initial evidence of the breach, if you looked at the share price performance during the SolarWinds, or at least the initial stages, because many people could say the SolarWinds thing is even continuing to this day, FireEye did have a notable market response to that breach. Now, that's obviously an idiosyncratic event unique to FireEye finding the breach. So, FireEye could just as easily be the victim of a breach in the future. So always saying FireEye is the answer is probably not the best approach. One approach could be the diversified basket of companies offering solutions. And if there are breaches, those solutions can be perceived to be more necessary and in greater demand and greater value. And so maybe a vehicle like what we've had at WisdomTree. But in the end, the perfect answer would almost be an inverse, or a derivative product based on the insurance claim, because there is such a thing as cybersecurity insurance. It's debated how effective it would be in the event of a wide-scale spate of claims, because there have been many articles written. I've seen a bunch in Harvard Business Review, just to name one example. But if you could have a derivative that was almost like they do with credit insurance, where they offer you a security where if the mortgage bond, back in 2008, 2009, it got a lot of publicity. If the mortgage bond is actually declining in value, the security increases in value. If such a thing could be created, which I apologize, I'm not aware, that would almost be your perfect hedge. So I apologize in the sense I'm not sure if that exists. The thing I am sure that exists are, again, the baskets of companies offering solutions which could be perceived to be more valuable in the event of high-profile breaches.
Chris, excellent answer. Thank you very much. I'm going to have to send you follow-up questions because we're getting right up against close of business here. I want to thank you very much for joining me today, Chris Ganati, the head of European research at WisdomTree, or head of research at WisdomTree Europe. There's probably a difference.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's alphabet soup. Chris Ganati, email us, go to the website. We're always happy to engage on the topic.
Brilliant. So, Chris, I will forward you the additional questions that have come in from our viewers. I want to thank everybody for taking the time to join me today, especially Chris Ganati from WisdomTree. And with that, Chris, I'll let you sign off, and I'll remind everybody that to look out for the recording link in the email in a couple of hours. Thank you, Chris.